The afternoon sun, heavy and warm, draped itself across the meticulously sculpted grounds of Oak Shadows Preserve. This wasn't merely a housing development. It was a carefully curated enclave that wore its exclusivity like a well-tailored, expensive suit. Rolling emerald lawns, free of even a single errant dandelion, flowed seamlessly into beds of meticulously pruned rose bushes, their blooms bursting in controlled explosions of color. The distant, rhythmic thwack of tennis balls striking taut strings drifted from the pristine, newly resurfaced courts, mingling with the gentle whisper of sophisticated irrigation systems, a soundscape designed to convey serene affluence. Yet, beneath this gleaming, polished veneer of upper-middle-class tranquility, subtle tensions simmered, often stoked, either deliberately or inadvertently, by the formidable presence of Margaret Sterling. Margaret wasn't just a resident. She was the undisputed, if unofficially crowned, Queen of the Homeowners Association Board, its most senior and influential member. A woman whose tailored power suits, in shades of charcoal and navy, seemed permanently fused to her rigid posture. She viewed Oak Shadows not as a collective of homes, but as her personal fiefdom, a domain to be regulated with an iron fist encased in a velvet glove, though the velvet was wearing increasingly thin, and guided by an unwavering, unshakable belief in her own supreme, infallible judgment. Her neighbors, weary of the constant, almost microscopic scrutiny, the endless stream of violation notices for infractions invisible to the normal eye, and the condescending pronouncements delivered with icy certainty, had long ago settled on a private name for her. Behind closed doors, in hushed tones or knowing glances exchanged over property lines, they simply called her Karen. Never, of course, to her face. Margaret Sterling's reign was one of aesthetic tyranny, enforced with crusading zeal. Just last month, she had engaged in a protracted, increasingly unpleasant battle with the Henderson family, ultimately compelling them, under threat of significant daily fines, to repaint their perfectly lovely front door because the chosen shade of deep burgundy was, in her unyielding opinion, precisely half a tone too dark according to the binder of approved exterior paint palettes maintained with religious devotion in the association office. She had personally issued fines, complete with photographic evidence timestamped to the minute, for recycling bins left innocently curbside a mere 10 minutes past the rigidly designated 7 p.m. retrieval time. She waged a silent, persistent war against anyone whose wind chimes dared to tinkle too melodically, deeming the gentle sounds, auditory pollution disruptive to the neighborhood's peaceful character. Whispers circulated about her veiled complaints leading to the quiet departure of a young family whose children's laughter, apparently, occasionally exceeded acceptable decibel levels during daytime hours. Her power stemmed not from charisma or consensus building, but from an encyclopedic, almost obsessive knowledge of the sprawling HOA bylaws, a document she wielded like a legal cudgel, and her relentless, almost joyless enforcement of every single clause, subclause, and footnote, no matter how picayune or nonsensical it seemed to others. She genuinely saw herself as the indispensable bulwark against creeping mediocrity, the vigilant guardian of property values, the sole, unappreciated reason Oak Shadows maintained its prestigious reputation and resisted the gravitational pull towards suburban blandness that afflicted lesser communities. Complaining neighbors often remarked, sotto voce, that the association fees kept rising, yet certain common areas seemed perpetually awaiting basic repairs, a disconnect Margaret always deflected with practiced ease, citing unforeseen costs or complex vendor negotiations. Living quietly, almost invisibly, amidst this tightly controlled, often anxiety-inducing environment was Mr. J. Park. Mr. Park, a gentle, silver-haired man of 79 years, was grappling with the encroaching, unpredictable fog of Alzheimer's disease. He resided with his devoted daughter, Sarah Chun, in a modest but immaculately well-kept home situated near the community's less ostentatious western edge. Mr. Park had once been a man of vibrant energy, an avid, meticulous gardener whose roses had been the envy of his previous neighborhood, and a surprisingly keen, agile amateur tennis player in his youth and middle age, known for his tricky serve and quiet sportsmanship. Now, his days were a fragmented mosaic of lucidity and confusion. There were precious moments of quiet recognition, his eyes clearing as he grasped Sarah's hand or recalled a specific detail from her childhood. These moments were interspersed with longer periods where the present dissolved, slipping away like sand through fingers, replaced by disconnected echoes of the past, familiar faces becoming momentarily strange, simple tasks suddenly insurmountable. Sarah, his only child, was a dedicated and highly accomplished assistant attorney general for the state, currently heading the specialized, demanding elder abuse prosecution task force. Her career required sharp intellect, unwavering focus, and the emotional fortitude to navigate complex, often heartbreaking cases involving the exploitation and abuse of society's most vulnerable seniors. She somehow managed to juggle the immense pressures of this vital work with the equally profound, often exhausting, responsibility of caring for her declining father. She cherished the fleeting moments of connection, the times when his gentle, kind spirit shone brightly through the cognitive haze, a reminder of the vibrant man he had always been. She had arranged for professional daytime caregiver help, a rotation of kind women who assisted with meals and daily needs, but Sarah often adjusted her own demanding schedule, utilizing secure remote access to work from home whenever possible, needing to be closer to him. The weight of his vulnerability, his dependence, a constant, grounding presence in her otherwise high-flying professional life. She'd noticed him seeming slightly more agitated lately, occasionally pacing near the front door, a new pattern that pricked her concern. On this particular sun-drenched, deceptively peaceful afternoon, Sarah was deeply engrossed in prepping for a major upcoming trial. Complex case files, deposition transcripts, and financial records spread meticulously across her dining room table. Her father's current caregiver, Maria, had stepped out for a brief, scheduled 30-minute break, a chance to run a quick errand. Mr. Park was resting quietly, or so Sarah assumed, in his favorite well-worn armchair positioned by the large window overlooking the small backyard garden, a space he could no longer actively tend but still loved to watch, observing the birds and the shifting patterns of light. A bright red cardinal landed momentarily on the bird feeder just outside the window, its cheerful, insistent chirp cutting through the quiet hum of the house. Perhaps it was the sudden sound, or maybe the glint of intense sunlight reflecting off the distant, chain-link fences surrounding the community tennis courts, visible through a narrow gap in the mature privacy hedges separating their property from the common area path. Something stirred within him. A fragmented memory surfaced, unbidden. A phantom echo, faint but tangible, of the satisfying weight of a wooden racket in his hand, the familiar fuzzy texture of a tennis ball, the satisfying, percussive plunk of a ball meeting strings, the green expanse of a court under a warm sun. It felt good. Familiar. Right. Slowly, almost hesitantly at first, then with a quiet, surprising purposefulness etched onto his usually placid features, Mr. Park rose from his armchair. He shuffled towards the front door. This particular door, with its slightly tricky deadbolt, sometimes proved confusing for him, a source of frustration. But today, perhaps distracted, Sarah or the caregiver had left it unlatched. It yielded easily to his gentle push. He stepped out into the warm embrace of the afternoon sun, his steps initially hesitant on the flagstone path, his eyes blinking against the brightness. Then, his gait gained a quiet determination, a sense of mission, however confused its origin. He wasn't fleeing. He wasn't intentionally wandering off in distress. He was simply following a fragile, shimmering thread of memory, an internal compass needle quivering towards the familiar sight and remembered feeling of the community tennis courts, nestled invitingly near the imposing brick clubhouse. He turned onto the paved common area pathway, his steps slow but steady, oblivious to the meticulously edged lawns bordering the concrete, the perfectly spaced, HOA-approved flowering annuals arranged in predictable patterns. He was simply a man adrift in the currents of time, seeking a place that resonated with a fading sense of self, a place that felt, however vaguely, like belonging. Meanwhile, Margaret Sterling was engaged in one of her customary, self-important patrols of the common areas. Dressed impeccably in crisp, cream-colored linen trousers, a starched powder blue blouse, and sensible but expensive-looking loafers, a clipboard clutched firmly in her hand like a badge of office, She was conducting a detailed inspection of the clubhouse grounds and the adjacent tennis court facilities. Association funds, after much debate dominated by Margaret's pronouncements on fiscal responsibility, had recently been allocated for minor upgrades, primarily the routine resurfacing of Court 1, and perhaps, if the budget allowed after her careful oversight, the addition of a couple of new, aesthetically appropriate benches near the spectator area. There had also been tentative, quickly stifled discussions, raised by a newer, more progressively minded board member, about the potential need for adding an accessibility ramp near the main concrete stairs leading down from the clubhouse patio level to the lower tennis courts. These stairs, 14 stark, utilitarian concrete steps, were undeniably steep and unforgiving, lacking even a central handrail. Margaret, during the brief board discussion, had dismissed the ramp idea out of hand, deeming it an unnecessary extravagance, and sniffily remarking that active individuals, for whom the courts were intended, had no issue with stairs. She considered the existing steps perfectly adequate, functional, and certainly more aesthetically pleasing than some clunky metal ramp cluttering the landscape. Her opposition had effectively tabled the motion indefinitely. Secretly, she had already mentally reallocated the funds tentatively earmarked for the ramp study towards a pet project of her own: upgraded landscaping around the clubhouse entrance, featuring imported topiary she particularly admired. Her sharp, critical eyes scanned the perimeter, assessing compliance. Everything seemed mostly orderly. The doubles match progressing on Court 1 involved players properly attired in predominantly white, as stipulated by the court rules. The landscaping crew, whose contract Margaret personally oversaw with hawk-like vigilance, had done an acceptable, if not exemplary, job trimming the boxwood hedges. Then, her gaze fixed, narrowed. She saw him, Mr. J. Park, standing somewhat uncertainly near the top of the concrete stairs, looking out towards the tennis players with a vacant, slightly confused expression on his face. He wore simple slacks and a comfortable cardigan, clearly not dressed for tennis. He seemed entirely out of place, a jarring, discordant note in her carefully orchestrated symphony of upper-middle-class perfection. An anomaly, a problem to be addressed. Margaret changed direction immediately, marching purposefully towards him, her expensive loafers clicking sharply, aggressively, on the paved pathway. "Excuse me," she snapped, her voice sharp, devoid of any warmth or courtesy, laced with undisguised impatience. She stopped directly in front of him, closer than necessary. "This area is restricted to players and their guests. You can't just wander around here aimlessly." Mr. Park turned slowly towards the sharp sound, visibly startled by her abrupt tone and sudden proximity. He blinked, his eyes struggling to focus on her stern face. A flicker of hopeful recognition, tied to the nearby courts, sparked briefly in his eyes. "Tennis," he murmured, his voice soft, hesitant. "Play tennis." The word hung in the air, poignant in its hopeful confusion. "Absolutely not," Margaret retorted instantly, her voice rising, dismissing his question and his presence with brutal finality. She stepped even closer, deliberately invading his personal space, forcing him back slightly. "This facility is exclusively for active, dues-paying members who are properly attired and actively engaged in play. You are clearly not playing. You appear lost. You need to leave this area immediately." Her tone was harsh, condescending, utterly dismissive. She saw not a frail, vulnerable elderly man grappling with a devastating neurological disease, but an unsightly nuisance, a potential liability, someone who simply didn't belong in her meticulously curated, exclusive space. He lowered the aesthetic standard. He disrupted the order. Just then, Mrs. Gable, another elderly resident known for her kind nature, who often exchanged pleasantries with Mr. Park during his accompanied walks with Sarah or the caregiver, happened to be walking nearby. Seeing the interaction, sensing the tension, she approached cautiously, her expression gentle, concerned. "Margaret, dear," she began softly, trying to mediate, her voice soothing. "Perhaps Mr. Park just got a little turned around. He lives with his daughter, Sarah Chun, just down the way on Willow Lane. He's quite harmless, wouldn't hurt a fly." Margaret pivoted sharply, shooting Mrs. Gable a withering glare that could curdle milk. "Stay out of this, Eleanor," she commanded coldly, cutting her off. This is an official HOA matter concerning unauthorized presence on association property. Rules are rules, and they apply to everyone, regardless of circumstances. He is trespassing, and frankly, she lowered her voice slightly but increased its intensity. He's disturbing the legitimate members who are trying to enjoy the facilities they pay handsomely for. She turned her venom back towards Mr. Park, her face hardening into an unforgiving mask. I said leave. Now. Mr. Park flinched visibly at her raised voice, the aggression in her tone penetrating his cognitive fog. He looked utterly lost now, his brief, hopeful connection to the past severed abruptly by her hostility. He didn't understand why this stern woman was so angry with him. He just wanted to watch the tennis. Confused and intimidated, he took a small, shuffling step backward, seeking instinctively to create distance from her anger. The movement brought him dangerously closer to the edge of the top concrete stair. That single, hesitant, backward step seemed to act as a final catalyst, igniting Margaret's simmering fury into open flame. Perhaps it was the perceived defiance in his retreat, the infuriating noncompliance with her direct order. Perhaps it was the sheer inconvenience of his presence marring her otherwise perfect afternoon patrol. Perhaps it was an outlet for some other, unrelated frustration simmering beneath her rigidly controlled exterior. In a sudden, shocking, almost unbelievable burst of violence, fueled by years of unchecked arrogance, a profound lack of empathy, and the toxic belief in her own untouchable authority, Margaret Sterling reached out with both hands and shoved Mr. Park hard, directly in the center of his chest. "Get out," she spat, the words laced with venom. The push was startlingly forceful, completely unexpected. Mr. Park, frail, elderly, and already unsteady, possessed neither the physical strength nor the cognitive awareness to react, to brace himself, to regain his balance. A small, bewildered cry escaped his lips as he staggered backward uncontrollably. His left foot slipped off the unforgiving concrete edge of the top stair. He tumbled, arms flailing uselessly in a desperate, futile attempt to grasp onto something, anything. Down the entire flight of 14 steep, hard concrete stairs he fell, his body bumping sickeningly against the sharp edges. The sequence of dull, heavy thuds echoed horribly in the sudden, horrified silence that descended upon the previously serene scene. He landed in a crumpled, unnatural heap at the bottom, on the lower concrete landing, completely, terrifyingly still. Mrs. Gable screamed, a sharp, piercing sound that cut through the air. Her hands flew instinctively to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock and horror. The tennis players on court 1 froze mid-swing, rackets dropping from slack fingers, staring in utter disbelief at the scene unfolding at the top of the stairs and the devastating result at the bottom. Margaret Sterling stood rigidly at the top of the stairs, looking down, almost dispassionately, at the crumpled, motionless form of Mr. J. Park. For a fleeting microsecond, a flicker of something shock, surprise at her own actions, crossed her tightly controlled features. But it vanished almost instantly, consciously suppressed, replaced by a chilling mask of cold justification, of self-preservation. She glanced briefly, dismissively, at the horrified onlookers, Mrs. Gable, the tennis players now slowly approaching the base of the stairs. Then, turning slightly away, she muttered, just loud enough for the distraught Mrs. Gable to hear clearly over her own gasping breaths, a phrase dripping with appalling, callous disdain, a phrase that would later haunt the courtroom. Natural selection. Just then, Sarah Chun hurried into view, her brisk walk quickly turning into a run, her face etched with palpable worry. She'd returned to her dining room table after checking on her father, only to find his favorite armchair empty and the front door slightly ajar. A cold dread instantly seized her. Panic rising, she'd immediately headed towards the clubhouse and tennis courts, knowing his occasional tendency, especially when confused, to wander towards places that held echoes of his past passions. She saw the small, unnaturally silent crowd gathered near the base of the tennis court stairs. She saw the stricken faces of the tennis players. She saw Mrs. Gable, white-faced and trembling. She saw Margaret Sterling standing stiffly, almost defiantly, at the top landing. And then her eyes fell upon the figure lying crumpled and motionless at the bottom. "Dad!" The cry was torn from her throat, a raw sound of pure anguish, disbelief, and terror. She sprinted down the pathway, pushing past a stunned, momentarily speechless Margaret without a second glance, her entire focus, her entire being, narrowing instantly onto her father. She dropped to her knees beside him on the hard concrete, her hands trembling uncontrollably as she made a rapid, professional assessment of his condition, years of dealing with vulnerable victims kicking in even through her own blinding panic. He was breathing, shallowly, irregularly, but breathing. His eyes were closed. Blood matted his silver-gray hair near his temple. One arm lay twisted at a horribly unnatural angle beneath him. "Dad? Dad, can you hear me? It's Sarah." Her voice cracked. Thick with tears she refused to let fall. Not yet. She immediately pulled out her personal cell phone, her fingers surprisingly steady as she dialed 911. Her voice, when she spoke to the dispatcher, was miraculously calm, controlled, delivering the essential information with practiced precision. "I need paramedics immediately at Oak Shadows Preserve Tennis Courts, lower level. Elderly male, 79, victim of a fall down approximately 14 concrete steps. Suspected head injury, possible fractures, witnessed assault reported." She gave the address, her exact location. Then, after ending the call, she took a deep, steadying breath. Slowly, deliberately, she stood up, brushing concrete dust from her knees. She turned, her gaze locking onto Margaret Sterling, who was already visibly composing herself, shifting back into her familiar mode of indignant authority, likely preparing a self-serving narrative. Sarah's profound grief and terror were momentarily eclipsed, overlaid by a wave of cold, razor-sharp, professional fury. The head of the state's Elder Abuse Prosecution Task Force locked eyes with the woman who had just, according to witnesses, violently assaulted her own vulnerable father. "Margaret Sterling," Sarah said, her voice dangerously low, quiet, but carrying an unmistakable weight of absolute authority that cut through the surrounding shocked silence. "I am Assistant Attorney General Sarah Chun." She paused, letting the name and title register, watching Margaret's eyes widen almost imperceptibly. "My father," she gestured with a controlled movement towards the crumpled form now being gently attended to by a tearful Mrs. Gable and one of the tennis players who had first aid training, "is the man you just shoved down those stairs." She took a step closer, her gaze unwavering, pinning Margaret in place. "As head of the state's Elder Abuse Task Force, I am officially informing you that you are being detained at this scene under suspicion of felony assault on a vulnerable adult. Do not move from that spot. Do not speak to anyone further, other than law enforcement when they arrive." Margaret Sterling's jaw literally dropped. The carefully constructed mask of haughty composure shattered completely. The color drained instantly from her face, leaving it pasty white beneath her expensive foundation, as the name, the title, the implications registered with the force of a physical blow. Assistant Attorney General, head of the Elder Abuse Task Force. This wasn't just the distraught daughter of the confused old man she'd callously shoved aside. This was the embodiment of the law, the very arm of the state responsible for prosecuting crimes exactly like the one she had just committed, standing before her, radiating cold, focused rage, and absolute authority. Her meticulously constructed world of HOA dominance, her bubble of perceived impunity, began to implode catastrophically. The callous justification, the ingrained belief in her untouchable authority within Oak Shadows, evaporated in an instant, replaced by the sudden, sickening onset of raw, dawning terror. The distant, rapidly approaching wail of sirens grew louder, closer, signaling the imminent arrival of paramedics and police, signaling the definitive end of Margaret Sterling's reign of petty tyranny, and signaling the beginning, the very swift beginning, of her personal and legal reckoning. The arrival of 2 paramedic units and multiple police cruisers transformed the normally serene tennis court area into a scene of controlled, urgent activity. Flashing lights pulsed against the manicured greenery and the clubhouse walls. Paramedics worked quickly and efficiently, stabilizing Mr. Park with expert care, fitting him gently with a cervical collar, assessing his vital signs, and carefully loading him onto a stretcher for transport. Sarah watched every movement, her heart constricting with each shallow, pained breath her father took. She felt agonizingly torn between her visceral need to climb into the ambulance with him and her professional obligation to ensure the integrity of the crime scene and the initial witness statements. She provided a concise, factual, emotionally controlled account to the first responding uniformed officers, identifying herself and her relationship to the victim, clearly indicating Mrs. Gable and the two tennis players who had remained on scene as primary witnesses. Her professional composure was a shield, absolute and necessary, though her eyes never strayed far from the ambulance as it carefully pulled away, its siren now silent but lights still flashing, carrying her father towards the uncertainty of the emergency room. Margaret Sterling, after a brief, initial attempt at indignant bluster, claiming Mr. Park had simply tripped, that she had merely tried to caution him, quickly crumpled under the combined weight of Assistant Attorney General Chin's palpable authority and the immediate, corroborating statements from the horrified, visibly shaken witnesses. Mrs. Gable, though tearful and trembling, recounted with firm clarity Margaret's aggressive tone, the forceful, two-handed shove, and, most damningly, the chillingly uttered phrase, natural selection, immediately after Mr. Park fell. The two tennis players independently confirmed seeing the distinct push and Mr. Park's subsequent backward tumble down the stairs. There was no ambiguity. Faced with multiple credible witnesses and the imposing presence of the state's lead elder abuse prosecutor, even if acting momentarily as a daughter, Margaret's defiance evaporated into panicked silence. A senior police detective arrived on scene, conferred briefly with Sarah and the initial officers, and then formally read Margaret her Miranda rights. Her face a mask of disbelief, fear, and dawning ruin, Margaret Sterling was handcuffed and placed securely in the back of a patrol car. The perceived, almost absolute power she wielded within the insular confines of Oak Shadows Preserve meant absolutely nothing here, under the harsh glare of criminal law. Given Sarah Chin's high-profile position within the state justice system and the horrific, deeply personal nature of the crime against her own father, the subsequent investigation proceeded with exceptional speed, resources, and scrutiny. Sarah, after spending anxious hours at the hospital beside her father, where doctors delivered the grim diagnosis, a fractured humerus in his left arm, multiple fractured ribs, internal bruising, and a serious concussion with potential long-term cognitive consequences, formally recused herself from any direct prosecutorial decision-making in the case to avoid conflict of interest. However, she directed her trusted chief deputy at the Elder Abuse Task Force to take the lead on the investigation, working in close partnership with the local police department's Major Crimes Unit. Her intimate knowledge of Oak Shadows, its internal politics, and specifically Margaret Sterling's long history of autocratic behavior within the association, proved invaluable background for the investigators. Sarah's mind, honed by years of prosecuting complex financial exploitation cases alongside physical abuse, immediately latched onto a detail beyond the assault itself. Suspecting that Margaret Sterling's blatant disregard for rules and empathy might extend beyond petty aesthetic tyranny and sudden violence into other areas of her HOA responsibilities, Sarah requested, through official channels, an immediate and thorough forensic audit of the Oak Shadows Preserve Homeowners Association finances. She specifically directed the auditors to focus on accounts and budgets over which Margaret had exercised primary signatory control, including maintenance reserves, operating expenses, and capital improvement funds allocated over the past 5 years. She vividly remembered the brief board discussion, nearly 2 years prior, about the potential need for an accessibility ramp near the tennis court stairs, the proposal Margaret had so quickly, contemptuously shut down, citing cost concerns. The very stairs her father had just tumbled down. A cold suspicion began to form in Sarah's mind, linking Margaret's opposition to safety measures with potential financial motives. A team of independent forensic accountants, contracted by the state, descended upon the HOA's financial records, housed in the small, overly decorated association office within the clubhouse. It didn't take long for the meticulous examination of ledgers, bank statements, invoices, and contracts to uncover not just minor irregularities, but a clear, systematic pattern of sophisticated deception and outright theft. Under the carefully maintained guise of managing community upkeep and finances with stringent oversight, Margaret Sterling had systematically embezzled substantial sums of money over a period of several years. The auditors found dozens of falsified invoices submitted by phantom landscaping companies for work never performed. They uncovered grossly inflated contracts awarded without competitive bidding to preferred vendors, contractors who, upon further investigation, were found to have personal or financial ties to Margaret, strongly suggesting kickback schemes. They traced numerous direct electronic transfers from HOA reserve accounts to Margaret's personal bank accounts and investment portfolios, thinly disguised as reimbursements for vaguely documented association expenses. Most damningly, and confirming Sarah's sickening suspicion, they discovered precisely what happened to the specific funds allocated by the board nearly 2 years prior, despite Margaret's vocal opposition, for the initial architectural design and feasibility study for the potential construction of the accessibility ramp near the tennis court stairs. The entire allocated amount, roughly $15,000, had vanished from the designated line item within weeks of its approval. Margaret had skillfully diverted the funds through a series of opaque internal transfers, ultimately using the money, along with other embezzled sums, to help fund personal luxuries the auditors easily traced. First-class airfare for European vacations, down payments on luxury vehicles registered in her name, high-end designer clothing purchased at exclusive boutiques, and contributions to hidden investment accounts. The audit revealed a staggering betrayal. Margaret Sterling had not only committed a brutal act of violence against a vulnerable resident, but she had also systematically stolen the very funds specifically designated for a safety feature that could have potentially made that dangerous area accessible and safer, perhaps even preventing the tragic fall she herself had caused. Her opposition to the ramp hadn't just been about aesthetics or misguided frugality. It was, at least in part, about protecting her illicit siphoning of association funds. The irrefutable evidence of large-scale, long-term financial fraud added significant weight and complexity to the already serious assault charges. Margaret Sterling now faced a daunting array of felony counts: aggravated assault on an elderly or vulnerable adult, carrying enhanced penalties, reckless endangerment resulting in serious bodily injury, and numerous charges related to grand theft, embezzlement by a fiduciary, wire fraud, and breach of fiduciary duty. The total amount confirmed embezzled was staggering, running well into 6 figures. Money stolen directly from her own neighbors, the residents of Oak Shadows Preserve she purported to serve and protect. Mr. Park remained hospitalized for several difficult weeks. He survived his significant physical injuries, eventually regaining limited use of his arm after surgery and rehabilitation. But the severe trauma of the fall, combined with the significant concussions superimposed on his pre-existing Alzheimer's, tragically accelerated the progression of his disease. His moments of clarity became rarer, shorter. The fog grew thicker, more persistent. Sarah visited him daily, somehow juggling her intense caseload with the heartbreaking reality of his irreversible decline, her resolve to see justice fully served hardening into tempered steel with each painful visit, each glimpse of the vibrant father fading further away. Margaret Sterling's trial was, inevitably, a local media spectacle. Oak Shadows residents packed the courtroom daily. Her expensive, high-powered defense lawyers attempted a multi-pronged, ultimately desperate strategy. They tried to portray her as a stressed, overworked, misunderstood community volunteer who simply snapped under pressure. They argued the shove was accidental, a reflexive reaction to feeling startled or potentially threatened by Mr. Park's unexpected presence. They attempted to characterize the glaring financial irregularities as mere unintentional bookkeeping errors, the result of sloppy record-keeping by a volunteer board, not deliberate theft. This carefully constructed narrative collapsed spectacularly under the weight of the prosecution's meticulously prepared, multi-layered case, presented with calm precision by Sarah's trusted chief deputy from the Elder Abuse Task Force. Witness testimony regarding the assault was devastating. Mrs. Gable, her voice trembling but clear, vividly described the unprovoked, forceful push and Margaret's horrifying, unforgettable natural selection comment. The tennis players corroborated the sequence of events precisely. Paramedics testified clinically about the severity and nature of Mr. Park's life-threatening injuries upon their arrival. Sarah Chun herself took the stand, not in her capacity as Assistant Attorney General, but simply as Jay Park's daughter. Her testimony was quiet, dignified, delivered with profound sadness but unwavering strength. She recounted her father's gentle nature, his past passions, his increasing vulnerability due to Alzheimer's, and the devastating, permanent impact the assault had inflicted on his already fragile health and cognitive function. Her words, devoid of legal jargon, filled with palpable love and loss, visibly moved the jury and silenced the courtroom. Then, the lead forensic accountant took the stand, methodically, painstakingly laying bare the complex, damning web of Margaret's multi-year embezzlement scheme. Using clear charts and summaries, the accountant traced the stolen funds, including the money specifically earmarked for the ramp feasibility study, directly to Margaret's personal accounts, luxury purchases, and hidden investments. Key emails and internal HOA communications, subpoenaed early in the investigation, were presented, starkly showing Margaret actively, forcefully opposing accessibility measures and mandatory safety upgrades, consistently citing prohibitive costs, while simultaneously, secretly, diverting the very funds allocated for those purposes to her own benefit. Margaret Sterling's own testimony proved disastrous for the defense. Placed under intense, probing cross-examination by the prosecutor, her carefully maintained composure finally, irrevocably cracked. She became defensive, argumentative, contradictory. Layers of arrogance, entitlement, deep-seated prejudice against those she deemed unfit for Oak Shadows, and a profound, shocking lack of genuine remorse were laid bare for the jury to see. She repeatedly blamed Mr. Park for wandering and trespassing. She blamed the other HOA board members for not appreciating her tireless efforts. She blamed the forensic accountants for maliciously misinterpreting her flexible and efficient management of association funds. Crucially, she expressed absolutely no empathy, no regret, no compassion whatsoever for Mr. Park or the suffering she had inflicted upon him and his family. The jury, observing her demeanor, listening to her self-serving deflections, clearly saw through the performance. The guilty verdict, delivered after only a few hours of deliberation, was decisive, guilty on all counts: the aggravated assault, the reckless endangerment, and all the major financial felony charges. Margaret Sterling stood stunned, swaying slightly, as her fate was sealed by the jury foreperson's solemn pronouncements. At the sentencing hearing weeks later, the judge, after reviewing the trial evidence, victim impact statements, and pre-sentencing reports, delivered a scathing indictment of Margaret Sterling's character and actions, his voice resonating with judicial anger. Ms. Sterling, your conduct in this case represents a profound and despicable betrayal on multiple, fundamental levels, the judge began, fixing her with a stern gaze. You brutally, callously assaulted a vulnerable, elderly member of the very community you were entrusted, as a fiduciary, to serve and protect. Your shocking disregard for his life and dignity, epitomized by your deplorable, utterly inhumane comment immediately after shoving him down 14 concrete stairs, is deeply disturbing to the conscience of this court and this community. He continued, his voice rising slightly. Furthermore, the evidence overwhelmingly demonstrates that you systematically, brazenly stole from your own neighbors over a period of years, enriching yourself while neglecting the essential safety, maintenance, and accessibility needs of the community association you controlled. This included the deliberate theft of funds specifically allocated for accessibility measures near the very location where your assault occurred. Funds that, if used as intended, might have aided Mr. Park or prevented such a tragedy. Your staggering greed, your cruelty, and your abuse of the trust placed in you appear to know few bounds. Citing the extreme violence of the assault compounded by the victim's pronounced vulnerability, the massive scale and duration of the financial fraud, the calculated breach of fiduciary duty, and Margaret's complete lack of remorse, the judge imposed a sentence reflecting the totality of her crimes. 25 years in state prison, with specific stipulations limiting the possibility of early parole. Additionally, invoking state statutes allowing for significant asset forfeiture in cases involving major financial fraud and elder abuse involving financial exploitation, the court ordered the immediate seizure of Margaret Sterling's significant personal assets, including her large house within Oak Shadows Preserve, her investment portfolios, bank accounts, luxury vehicles, jewelry, and expensive designer goods. Essentially, everything traceable to the embezzled HOA funds, or representing her. Accumulated personal wealth above a nominal amount. In an unusual but powerfully symbolic directive, the judge ordered that the substantial forfeited assets, after fully satisfying mandatory restitution payments to the Oak Shadows Preserve HOA for the stolen funds, be placed into a special state-managed trust. The primary purpose of this trust, the judge mandated, was specific. A significant portion was to be earmarked immediately to finally fund the design and construction of not just the long-delayed accessibility ramp at the tennis courts, but also a dedicated, state-of-the-art memory care wing, either attached to the existing Oak Shadows Community Center or established through a partnership with a suitable nearby facility. This wing, the judge specified, would be designed expressly to support current and future Oak Shadows residents grappling with Alzheimer's disease and other dementias, ensuring their safety, dignity, and specialized care within their own community. As a final, poignant measure, the judge strongly suggested, incorporating Sarah Chin's quiet request, that the new facility be formally named in honor of Mr. J. Park. The conviction and subsequent downfall of Margaret Sterling sent seismic shockwaves through the carefully manicured enclave of Oak Shadows Preserve. The HOA board was promptly dissolved by court order and subsequently reformed under entirely new resident leadership. Individuals publicly committed to transparency, fiscal responsibility, compassion, and actual community service rather than punitive, arbitrary enforcement. The oppressive atmosphere began to dissipate, slowly shedding the pervasive climate of fear and suspicion Margaret had meticulously cultivated over years. Neighbors started talking again, tentatively at first, then more openly, checking in on each other, replacing wary glances with small gestures of connection and mutual support. Sarah Chun, while navigating the profound, ongoing grief of witnessing her father's irreversible decline, found a measure of hard-won solace in the decisive, comprehensive justice served. The conviction felt like a validation, not just for her father, but for all the vulnerable seniors her task force fought to protect. She continued her vital work with renewed passion and determination, often using her family's painful ordeal, with careful anonymization, to advocate forcefully for stronger elder abuse laws and enhanced protections for vulnerable adults statewide. Mr. Park was eventually moved from the hospital to a highly rated specialized memory care facility outside Oak Shadows, where he received the constant, compassionate, expert attention his advanced condition required. Sarah visited often, holding his hand, sharing memories he might or might not grasp, finding moments of peace in his quiet presence. When the new memory care wing, funded in significant part by the assets seized from the woman who had so cruelly harmed him, eventually opened its doors adjacent to the Oak Shadows Community Center nearly 2 years later, a quiet dedication ceremony was held. A simple, elegant plaque bearing the name, the J. Park Memorial Wing, was installed near the entrance, a quiet testament to resilience, a lasting symbol of justice ultimately, meaningfully prevailing over cruelty, greed, and indifference. Oak Shadows Preserve began its long healing journey, forever changed by the tragedy that had unfolded on its pristine grounds, but ultimately emerging, slowly, cautiously, as a stronger, more caring, and hopefully more vigilant community from the long, dark shadow cast by its fallen Karen. Sarah, standing by the plaque after the ceremony, felt a complex mix of sorrow and peace, touching her father's name etched in bronze, a bittersweet end to a painful chapter.